Hi folks, we're Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the concept of and the practice of propaganda. So over the last, 90, 100 years, and just look at what it was like in the earlier part of last century, especially its use by authoritarian regimes or even democratic regimes going through an authoritarian phase, and see how it compares to today. Now, I think we all know, we've all heard the term, that propaganda would make Goebbels blush. Goebbels. So Joseph Goebbels, the German propaganda minister in the Nazi administration, he's held up as the exemplar, the absolute of this outrageous Nazi evil fascist propaganda, and I, among others, would I've even used the term myself, would make Goebbels blush, make Goebbels look like a choir boy, and it's just thrown out. The same thing in movie making. I see so often commentators saying, "Oh well, I'm not Leni Riefenstahl, the Nazi movie maker." But when you sort of ask anybody, it comes out, well, what propaganda did Goebbels do that would sort of give him this title of being the arch propagandist of all time? Can you give me even one example of it? So it's really just become a term that's synonymous with evil and bad propaganda. Joseph Goebbels, shake, shiver, and so we need to maybe go back a little bit and just look, and because if I actually looked, I spent some time online looking for examples of Goebbels propaganda that you could hold up and say, well, look, that is fucking evil. That is evil of the evil. That makes evil look evil. And I couldn't find any. Now they must exist. I suppose the broadest mention of it is in various Jewish chronicles, but even there, it's sort of broad and wider assertions that anything negative about the Jewish people must be evil in itself. Therefore, Goebbels must be evil. But the examples are fairly, you really struggle to find any examples, and the ones that are used are tight, very very cherry picked. So the reason that Goebbels propaganda doesn't seem like such a big deal today, or certainly what I've found, and I looked for the evil stuff because that's what I wanted to use for the video, and I'll give a couple of examples in a minute. But really, if you look at the theory of propaganda, its uses and its practices, it was, I suppose, in its early days, it's become far more refined and sophisticated and extensive and caught up in ideology rather more than political purpose as it was then. So when we compare the propaganda today that you'd see just on any of the major globalist controlled news networks, the A, omission, and B, outright lies, lies upon more lies, then Goebbels was quite restrained by comparison. So so he looks fairly tame compared to the propaganda usages and methodologies of the brazen lying that you see today, which almost transcends propaganda. We control the media landscape, so we can tell any lie we want, and you can't disprove it, and we can make enough people believe it. Whereas Goebbels was much more cautious in his approach. If there was one sort of half fact, it would be surrounded by clear, irrefutable facts. So he was quite careful to move the conversation along gradually, and in other times was surprisingly candid in the propaganda. Now Goebbels was he's a usual guy. He's like 5'2", this skinny guy, and he's had polio as a kid, so he's still got a limp from the effects of the polio. When he talks about sort of some of his earlier writings, he mentions a number of teachers who he thought were quite influential and that he admired, and he thanked them for encouraging him to engage in intellectual pursuits, which he probably had to, because he was hardly going to be a star footballer or something with his polio or the effects of polio. And most of those teachers were Jewish, interestingly. When he was, I think just out of high school, he dated a Jewish girl, so you wouldn't call him, committed anti-Semite or anything. Now, as the radio and movies, particularly talking movies, were quite new in terms of technological advances at the time. So nobody really had much experience on how to use them for propaganda purposes. Now, the Nazis were trying to really compensate for a few things. Firstly, they were trying to recover German national pride. And something I mentioned previously is Germany only federated as a nation in 1870. And during the time of the Weimar Republic, they had a very real problem, real issue, that the provinces may break off and either become completely self-governing as like a separate country, or that the regions would demand local powers and authorities that would effectively make the federal government irrelevant. Now, these were very real issues for Germany at the time, and the Nazis were seeking to compensate for that by creating a national feeling. We're all Germans, and we're all one nation, this sort of thing. And so the propaganda they used to encourage that viewpoint was later. So, well, there you go. Look at those damn Nazis. Look what they're doing. When in reality, they were trying to establish, national identity, national cohesion, or re-establish it. It was there before World War One, but was on the verge of being lost following World War One and into the Depression, and of course the Weimar Republic and the endless attempts by communist infiltrators to launch a communist insurrection. One of the more famous of which was the Spartacist uprising, which was led by a Jewish lesbian out of a Jewish lesbian school teacher, no less. So Goebbels, a lot of that Nazi propaganda, which Goebbels was sort of in the driving seat there for quite a while, was to do with those sort of encouraging positive views about Germany. Another thing was that there'd been a lot of plays and books and so on that had been read primarily by Jewish authors during the Weimar time that had really called into question not only capitalism, because many of them were communist sympathizers, not only had questioned capitalism, but also introduced and were pushing heavily, gay, lesbian type situations, much of what you see today, really, and the globalist push. So there was, that infamous book burning thing. Most of that was really those sort of books, pushing sexual themes on children, that sort of thing. So most of that was the book burning. The idea that they running around, book burning Shakespeare or something, that's bullshit. So the propaganda was, now there are cases where, say in the instance of once the war began, then there were just propaganda justifications for the war. A lot of Germans didn't really want war, so the idea that there was this warlike people clamoring for war is bullshit. That wasn't true, and you can see this in commentaries by international journalists at the time. Soon as war became closer and closer, and Hitler's brinksmanship became riskier and riskier, especially through Czechoslovakia and then later with Poland. The people could sense that there was military conflict coming, and they didn't really want that. The memory of World War One was still fresh, and the shortage of food and the aftermath of that. So there was a lot of concern about it, and journalists back in the time would note that Germans were no longer sort of in the streets, with sort of a sense of happiness, gaiety, this sort of thing, and they were instead looking concerned and haggard. Places where people would be gathering to have a good time and have a chat were now empty, and things like that. And so there was, as war became sort of imminent and everyone could see it, there was a very marked change in the mood of the nation. Something that Hitler was aware of. And Hitler, we've got to make sure that everybody still has enough food to eat and access to consumer goods, and as soon as they're deprived of these things, then they may not be as supportive, if supportive at all, of the war. So there was the propaganda was to justify war, or to accept it in the minds, or get it accepted in the minds of the public. For example, was quite a well-known thing that the Goebbels and the ministry put on, something that's used today to condemn white people, to condemn straight white men, to condemn families. The same propaganda. In fact, more graphic today than it was then, because back in the time it was more suggestive than actual. The imagination had to fill in the gaps. But there's a supposed crazed Polish guy. Looks like he's escaped from a lunatic asylum. He's an insane guy. And there's this little German girl, blonde in a little white dress, and she's skipping next to an idyllic stream with lots of nice flowers and so on. And then there's the shot of the crazed Polish guy, and then there's the next shot is the dead little German girl. We have to have little; it has to be a girl. And the dress is arranged in a way that clearly suggests there was defilement of the innocent young girl, and this was outrageous. And well, there was nothing for it. We got to hold those bums to account, and let's get our soldiers in there. And you think you can fuck with us, motherfucker? So there's that sort of thing. There's other propaganda as well, where Warsaw had a very large Jewish population, and much of it as a result of the movements of Jewish populations following World War I and the rewriting of boundaries, the expulsion of some of the Jewish farmers from what today is Ukraine and Belarus, and these people moving into Russia, moving into Poland. So now there was because these people arrived with nothing, and Poland was hardly a buoyant economy, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland at the time. So some of these people were living hand to mouth, and living in buildings that were on the verge of falling down, and so on. So German newsreels and Nazi newsreels were taking, recording footage of the way these people were leaving and saying, well, that's how Jews live. Do we want people like this amongst us? And that was a misrepresentation. But when you look at the propaganda style and the usage of propaganda by Goebbels, he still was very reluctant, or the propaganda style was very reluctant to tell outright lies. You could go half-truths, you could do those sorts of things, you could omit something key, you could not give the background story or the backstory to something, you could do that. But it had to be factual to a large extent, and very difficult for anyone looking at it to see behind, that there was an ideological motivation, or that the facts weren't as they were. And you're looking at it again, today, it's very tame by today's standards. Goebbels did avoid telling outright lies, not like today, when the outright lies are concealed by, we've got enough control of the media, we can control the narrative. If we script it and keep it consistent, we all come in with the same message, we can create the truth, we can invent the truth, we can invent the reality. And that was even a step or two further than even the Nazis went. Now come sort of during the war, particularly as the early 1943, the type of propaganda changed, or the tone of it. Instead of having stories about the heroism of German military exploits, that sort of thing, it changed to if we don't accept a war economy, because previous to that, the economy, at the end of 1942, the German economy was only operating at about the same levels as it had in 1937-38 before the war even began. That's because Hitler was quite determined to keep the economy as or keep the German people shielded as much as possible from the effects of a war economy. So they kind of didn't run a war economy and got away with it early because of the Blitzkrieg victories. But when they became bogged down in a longer war in the Soviet Union, communist Russia at the time, then Hitler still hadn't switched to a war economy. Even as Stalingrad, the disaster of Stalingrad was unfolding, Hitler was still resisting the war economy. And yet, had they gone to war economy, straight away, then they would have the Nazis would have easily prevailed in the conflict, provided they'd gone to war economy quite quickly. Even if they'd ratcheted it up a couple of notches or a few notches, because of, say, producing 100 tanks a month, for example, 100 tanks a month. If they'd increased that to 150 tanks a month, they would have won. It was that finely balanced between victory and loss at that point. So Goebbels was getting it, even personally making speeches, and he was quite a good sort of speech writer and speech deliverer, where he would say, "Look, we've got to go to war economy, otherwise we're screwed." And this was, I think, the very beginning of 1943. And he was making a lot of those sort of speech, and also putting out a lot of propaganda across radio, across the talking movies. Again, talking movies were quite new at the time. So that propaganda was to change minds, that this is what we need to do. Now, if you compare the propaganda of say, Britain, propaganda of the United States, and particularly the more authoritarian Soviet Union, then again, Goebbels doesn't come off that badly, actually. The communist propaganda is way worse, far more lies than that. The British propaganda is quite paranoid. There are Nazis in our midst, and they're telling Hitler all our secrets and that sort of stuff. And that struck me as rather odd, because it was very far-fetched, and it was used by the British government to go and persecute people and chase after people who'd committed no crime. So it was, measured by the British government to, as it happened in the United States, to engage in arbitrary arrest. Now, it's not because people were in the eyes of the British government, at least, because people actually were a threat. It was more to terrorise the population generally. Now, there were some genuine things, like the guy who owned the Italian ice cream shop, because Italy was a combatant in the war. Well, we can't take the risk that this guy won't try and blow up the local electricity substation, so we'll put them all in detention. Now, that's quite high-handed, because the guy hasn't committed any crime. It's like a pre-crime thing. But we see that today. Well, you're a straight white male. How do we know you're not a Nazi? So we'll put you in prison just in case maybe you could be. So if we look at the overall propaganda side, it's Joseph Goebbels propaganda. Other people, you check it, you have a look, see what you think. But I see that the propaganda is pretty tame. There are things like he complains about. This is earlier in probably 1934-5, around there. He complains about a certain diaspora that's involved in saying that Germany's an illegitimate nation, and it should be taken over by a communist uprising and these sorts of things, and constantly sowing social division, racial division, and gender division. And we all know who that diaspora is. They do it today. And so he's pushing back against that, saying, well, why are these people doing this? And they often own movie theatres and playhouses and so on. So now in the night of the Kristallnacht, Act, and this is viewed sort of from a propaganda viewpoint today as being the apex of Nazi oppression of Jews. the Jews were arrested represented about 8% of the adult population, 9%, say, depending on whose numbers you want to use of the adult population. And well, not even that much. No, it probably was about that much, actually. Some of it was arbitrary, but primarily it was Jews that were unable to get visas to go abroad, and who were the most vocal in agitating against the Nazi regime. Anyone did that was anyone did that was probably asking for trouble, as it would be today if you were advocating for stopping mass migration to the West. You would be viewed as an enemy of the state, in effect, by the globalists, and the same there. So if it's bad for them to do it, isn't it also bad today to do it? Why is it only bad when they do it, but okay today? No, it's bad. You can't do that. You can't arbitrarily arrest people or assign some sort of ideological type crime to them and arrest them on that basis and deprive them of liberty. That's not acceptable then, nor is it now. And equal protection under the law, if anything we've learnt from the Nazi or the Soviet or whatever, Pol Pot, if anything we've learnt from that everybody must have equal protection under the law. Everybody must have equal protection under the law through independent apolitical courts. So I can't see again, Goebbels is held up as the propaganda meister of the universe, but compared to what's going on today, it's pretty tame stuff, and I think we've got to pick a new one. Maybe, I don't know. Just look at the head of the UN or something, and we need a new one now, because Goebbels, not simply from technological reasons, but Goebbels actually isn't that big a deal in the overall scheme of things compared to what we're seeing today. But I'd be interested in your thoughts. So post your opinions below, and you've been with Tacitus today, and thank you for listening.